Minutes later, Simmons appeared in the hallway. He was wearing his usual crisp suit, looking every bit the polished, condescending bureaucrat he was. He extended a hand, but Alex ignored it, not wanting to be cordial. "You installed power lines on my land," Alex said flatly. Simmons raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about? Power lines? Don't play dumb with me, Simmons. There are power lines on my property. You didn't get permission. I want to know what's going on." Simmons' smile faltered. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Alex. There's no record of any such installation. Perhaps you're confused? Our work is always communicated to homeowners ahead of time." Alex could barely contain his anger. "You didn't communicate anything to me. I'm standing on my own property, and you've installed this infrastructure without my consent. I want it removed immediately." Simmons chuckled, clearly not taking the situation seriously. Alex, relax. There's no need to get so worked up. The HOA is always looking out for the community. Those power lines are part of an important initiative to expand the grid. It's a benefit to everyone in the neighborhood." Alex's eyes narrowed. "It's on my land? I'm not stupid. What's really going on?" "I assure you, there's nothing sinister going on," Simmons said smoothly, though there was a subtle flicker of unease in his eyes. "Everything is above board." "That's not the point," Alex snapped. "I'm the one who has to deal with this mess. You can't just come in and set up shop on my property like you own it." Simmons sighed dramatically, his expression turning patronizing. "Listen, Alex, I understand your frustration. But there's no reason to escalate things. If you'd like, we can schedule a meeting to discuss the situation. Perhaps you'll understand better once you get the full picture." Alex clenched his fists. "I don't need a meeting. I need you to undo what you've done." Simmons held up his hands in mock surrender. "If you'd like, we can get the lawyers involved. But let's be clear, the HOA has the legal right to do this. We have approval from the city for this expansion, and it's in the best interest of the community." The words, legal right, echoed in Alex's mind, and he could feel his blood pressure rising. He knew exactly how these things worked. The HOA had the power, the legal backing, and the financial influence to make his life miserable. And they were using all of it. He wasn't just fighting against a few wires on his land, he was up against a system that could bury him in red tape, legal fees, and endless bureaucracy. "I'll get a lawyer," Alex said through gritted teeth. "And I'll fight you on this." Simmons gave him a reassuring smile, but it was the smile of a man who knew he was on solid ground. "I'm sure you will. But I think you'll find the law is on our side, Alex. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Alex stood there for a moment, glaring at the man who had just brushed him off. His blood boiled as Simmons turned and walked away. It wasn't just about the power lines anymore. It was about the principle. It was about the way the HOA had grown so powerful, so out of touch with the people it was supposed to serve. They thought they could walk all over him, and maybe they were right. But that didn't sit well with Alex. Not at all. As he walked back to his house, his mind raced. He'd tried the legal route, and that had failed before he'd even begun. The HOA wasn't going to back down. They had the resources, and they knew how to play dirty. Alex was on his own in this. If he wanted to get anywhere, he'd have to fight back in a way they wouldn't expect. By the time Alex reached his front door, the seed of an idea had begun to sprout. It was a dangerous idea, risky and audacious, but it was the only one that had a chance of success. He wasn't going to play by their rules. He'd write his own. And this time, he'd take the fight directly to them. The next few days were filled with a mounting sense of urgency. Alex had never been one to act without careful thought, but something about the HOA's audacity had shaken him. They had crossed the line, not just with the power lines but with the entire way they treated residents. He couldn't let them get away with it. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that the legal route was a dead end. The HOA was too well connected, too powerful. They'd bury him in paperwork and delay tactics until he gave up. But there was another way, something more direct. Something they wouldn't see coming. That night, after dinner, Alex sat at his desk and began to map out his plan. He knew he had to act quickly. The HOA might not be able to remove the lines immediately, but they could easily cement their control if they got the power grid fully integrated. He had to hit them before they had a chance to finish what they started. Alex wasn't a technician or an electrician, but his legal background had made him a quick learner. Over the years, he'd accumulated a few practical skills out of necessity: minor repairs, wiring issues, even some basic electrical work. Enough to know where the real vulnerabilities were. It wasn't the power lines themselves that gave him an advantage. It was the infrastructure surrounding them, the cables, the connections. He'd done his homework. His first step was to gather the right equipment. A quick trip to a hardware store in a nearby town, away from the prying eyes of his neighbors, and Alex had everything he needed: a pair of industrial wire cutters, a power meter, and a generator. It wasn't a huge investment, but it was all he'd need to make a statement. Over the next couple of days, Alex prepared. He spent hours researching the utility company and the power grid layout, cross-referencing maps and diagrams. He tracked down the locations of the main connections and service boxes that fed into the neighborhood. He learned how to disengage the system with minimal disruption. And he wasn't just preparing for a temporary interruption. He was going to make sure that the HOA would never forget the power they had tried to steal. It was late on the third night after his meeting with Simmons when Alex finally decided to act. He knew it was risky, but the more he thought about it, the more he knew there was no other option. He had to do this himself. Under the cover of darkness, Alex loaded his gear into the back of his car and drove to the power poles. The neighborhood was eerily quiet at this hour, with most of the residents asleep or watching TV. The lights in the houses flickered, the hum of power in the air, as if the grid itself was a living, breathing entity. But Alex wasn't intimidated. This was his land, and he wasn't going to let anyone, especially the HOA, take it from him. He parked a few blocks away from the site, where no one would see him. The street lights cast long shadows over the street, and the moon was just a sliver in the sky. Alex checked his watch and then made his way through the darkness, keeping to the edges of the lawns and avoiding the streetlights. He wasn't worried about anyone catching him. Most of the neighborhood had long since settled into a predictable routine. No one would be out at this hour. When he reached the poles, his heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. He had prepared for this moment, thought through every detail, but still, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts. What if something went wrong? What if he couldn't get the power back on? But he shoved those thoughts aside. He wasn't about to turn back now. Alex set up his equipment and surveyed the area. The power lines were simple enough to access, well within his reach. He knew exactly where to cut. A few snips, a careful adjustment of the connections, and he could sever the lines without causing a long-term disruption. The goal wasn't to damage the infrastructure permanently, but to create a clear, undeniable message. The HOA had overstepped, and Alex wasn't going to stand by while they trampled on his rights. With a deep breath, Alex stepped forward and began cutting the wires. The first cut was clean, and the second followed shortly after. The power lines, once humming with electricity, now hung loosely between the poles, severed at key points. He looked around one last time to ensure there were no witnesses. Satisfied, he took out his power meter and checked the readings. The grid was effectively down in the area. There would be no power flowing to the neighborhood for the next few hours, at least, not until someone realized what had happened and fixed it. As Alex stood there, the weight of his actions began to sink in. The moment had passed, and there was no going back. He was fully committed now. This wasn't just about power lines. It was about sending a message to the HOA and the people who thought they could control everything. He wasn't just a homeowner. He was a force to be reckoned with. Before he left, Alex placed an anonymous tip to a local news outlet, knowing that the blackout would soon attract attention. He didn't want credit for the act, but he wanted the HOA's dirty laundry aired for the world to see. As he packed up and headed back to his car, he felt a sense of satisfaction wash over him. For the first time in days, he felt in control. By the time Alex arrived back home, the neighborhood had begun to stir. The first of the lights began flickering off in nearby homes, and the distant hum of the grid had been replaced with silence. He sat down on his couch, exhausted but exhilarated, and waited for the inevitable chaos to unfold. It didn't take long for the neighbors to notice. The phone lines started lighting up with complaints. It wasn't just one or two homes affected, it was the entire block. And soon enough, the news was out. A blackout, no explanation, and no sign of what had caused it. The HOA would be forced to act, and they'd be caught in the spotlight of their own making. Alex had won round one. The battle was just beginning. The blackout had barely lasted an hour before the phone calls started flooding in. Alex watched from his window as his neighbors wandered out of their homes, trying to make sense of the sudden outage. He didn't immediately call the authorities or report the incident. Instead, he waited, watching the chaos unfold. He knew the HOA would take the blame for this, and he wanted to ensure they did. This wasn't just about a few missing lights. It was about forcing them to confront the reality of their greed and corruption. By the time the local news outlet Alex had tipped off started broadcasting a report on the blackout, the neighborhood was in full uproar. People were starting to panic, especially those working from home or relying on medical equipment. The HOA's involvement was becoming the central topic of conversation, even though no one had yet figured out who was behind the sabotage. As Alex expected, the HOA's first reaction was predictable: deflection. Simmons, the HOA president, issued a statement blaming a malfunction in the grid and promised quick repairs. But he was caught off guard when the news outlet ran Alex's anonymous tip, detailing how the power lines had been illegally installed and speculating that they may have been tampered with. The community was stunned. The HOA was supposed to be the protector, the governing body that managed everything, yet here it was, embroiled in a scandal that could spiral out of control. But Alex wasn't satisfied with just causing a temporary inconvenience. He had to ensure the HOA would pay the price for their arrogance. It wasn't just about cutting the power. It was about taking away the leverage they'd held over the residents for so long. Late the next day, after Simmons had issued a public apology, Alex received a call from a representative of a private renewable energy company that had been following the story. The company was a relatively new player in the energy sector, but they had deep pockets and a strong track record in community-based power solutions. The representative, a woman named Claire, introduced herself and said that they were interested in discussing a proposal with Alex. She was calm, professional, but there was something in her voice that told Alex this was more than just a business opportunity. It was a potential solution to a much bigger problem. "We've been following the situation in New Eden," Claire said. "And we believe there's a real opportunity here, not just to fix the energy grid, but to change the way this community thinks about power. We'd like to offer you a deal." Alex was skeptical at first, assuming it was another empty pitch, but Claire quickly outlined her company's plan. They had the resources to create an independent, sustainable microgrid powered by solar energy. The company wanted to partner with Alex, offering him a chance to sell the grid rights to his land. In exchange, Alex would receive a substantial payout, and the community would benefit from a cleaner, more reliable energy source. The HOA would have no say in the matter. It was an offer that Alex knew he couldn't refuse. For Alex, the deal was simple: take down the HOA's stranglehold on the neighborhood and offer a better alternative. The more he thought about it, the more he saw the potential in the proposal. It wasn't just about taking down the HOA. It was about ensuring the community would never be at the mercy of corrupt entities like them again. If he played his cards right, he could turn this situation into a victory for everyone. The negotiations were swift. Alex was no longer dealing with a neighborhood issue. He was negotiating with professionals who knew the business inside and out. The company's offer was solid, and Alex knew they could make it work. They had the money, the expertise, and the drive to change New Eden's energy future. The HOA would be blindsided, and the residents, once they realized what Alex had pulled off, would be forever grateful. A few days later, Alex called Simmons to let him know about the offer. Simmons, as expected, was furious. "You can't do this, Mercer. You don't have the right to sell the grid rights. This is our community, our infrastructure," Simmons shouted. "I don't remember you asking for my permission when you installed those power lines," Alex replied coolly. "I'll be signing the contract with the company tomorrow. The HOA's control over this neighborhood is over." Simmons sputtered, trying to regain his composure. "You'll regret this, Mercer. We'll fight you in court. You'll see how much power you really have." "I'm not interested in fighting. I'm interested in changing the game," Alex said, hanging up before Simmons could respond. The following week, Alex met with Claire to finalize the deal. It was a quiet meeting, one filled with the promise of a better future for New Eden. The paperwork was signed, and the deal was done. The HOA was out, and a new chapter was about to begin. Once the news of the deal broke, the community's reaction was swift. Residents were thrilled at the prospect of a cleaner, more reliable energy grid. The HOA's attempts to spin the story were futile. No one cared about their excuses or apologies anymore. The community had a new vision, one that didn't include an overbearing, corrupt HOA dictating every aspect of their lives. As the installation of the new solar-powered microgrid began, Alex couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The HOA had been reduced to a powerless entity, and the residents were finally taking control of their own future. Alex had done more than just cut a few power lines. He had started a revolution, a quiet one, perhaps, but a revolution nonetheless. By the time the grid was up and running, New Eden was transformed. The solar panels glistened in the sun, the energy was cleaner, and the community was more self-sufficient than ever before. The HOA was a shadow of its former self, its leadership changed, and its influence reduced to a mere fraction of what it had once been. Alex leaned back in his chair, staring out at the neighborhood he had helped change. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. It had been a long battle, but he had won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been pushed around by the HOA's overreach. And now, New Eden had a future that no one could control but the people who lived there. The final stage of Alex's plan was unfolding faster than he expected. The solar-powered microgrid had become a reality, and the community was already starting to see the benefits. Residents were excited to see the promise of clean, reliable energy taking shape before their eyes. The initial skepticism from some was quickly replaced with awe as they realized the true power of Alex's vision. No longer would they be held hostage by the whims of the HOA or the monopoly of the utility company. Alex had done what seemed impossible. He had turned the tables on those who sought to control everything. The first official community meeting since the grid deal was announced was scheduled for that week. Alex had spent the past few days making sure every detail was ironed out, ready for the residents to hear about the change that was coming. The HOA was expected to attend as well, though Alex doubted they would have much to say after the hammering they'd taken from the public. The residents, however, were a different story. They were ready to take control, to be part of something bigger, something that could free them from years of manipulation. As Alex entered the community hall that evening, he was greeted by dozens of curious and eager faces. People whispered among themselves, their expressions a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Alex didn't need to say much to know what they were thinking. The question on everyone's mind was simple: how could one man bring this much change to a community so tightly controlled by the HOA? He stood before the crowd, calmly surveying the room. This was it, the moment of truth. He wasn't just selling them on solar power or renewable energy. He was giving them the chance to take back what had been stolen from them for years: their autonomy. They weren't just buying into an idea. They were buying into a future where they controlled their own destiny. "Good evening, everyone," Alex began, his voice steady and firm. "I know many of you are wondering how we got to this point. You've been living under the shadow of the HOA for far too long, just like I have. But things are changing now. The power, both literally and figuratively, is in our hands." A few people nodded, and Alex could see the excitement building in their eyes. The notion of taking back control from the HOA, a force they had all learned to fear, was suddenly within reach. We've reached an agreement with a renewable energy company to establish an independent microgrid here in New Eden, Alex continued. This means no more interference from the HOA. No more being forced into their regulations. We're not just going to be consumers of energy anymore, we're going to be participants in it. We'll have our own system, our own power, and our own say in how it's used. The room was silent for a moment as the weight of his words settled in. Alex could tell that some were still processing the magnitude of the change, but others were already on board. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. People were waking up to the possibility that things could be different. They could be free from the HOA's stranglehold. We've seen what happens when a few people with power decide they can do whatever they want, Alex said, his voice growing stronger. We've seen it with the illegal installation of power lines on my property. But now we have a choice. We can continue to let outside forces dictate our lives, or we can take the power back. Literally. The energy in the room shifted once again, this time to one of full support. People were no longer just passive observers. They were becoming active participants. They were starting to see themselves as part of the larger movement. Alex could feel the momentum building, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they fully embraced the idea. The next step is simple, Alex said, glancing around the room. The microgrid will be up and running soon, and it's time for us to fully commit. This is not just a project, it's a chance to show that we can make our own decisions, outside of the control of the HOA and the utility companies. We're going to build something stronger, more sustainable, and more independent. At that moment, someone in the crowd raised their hand. It was a middle-aged woman, someone Alex hadn't spoken to much before, but he knew her well enough to know she wasn't easily swayed. How do we know this will work? She asked, her voice a little shaky. What's to stop the HOA from coming back and trying to shut it all down? Alex smiled, a reassuring, confident smile. We've already taken steps to ensure that won't happen. The agreement with the renewable energy company is binding. We're going to be a self-sustaining community. The HOA can't take this away from us. Not anymore. The woman nodded slowly, and the room seemed to exhale in unison. The tension that had built up over years of HOA control was finally starting to dissipate. People were beginning to understand that this wasn't just about energy. It was about reclaiming their rights and their community. By the end of the meeting, the crowd was on their feet, clapping and cheering. It wasn't just a victory for Alex. It was a victory for everyone who had felt powerless for so long. The HOA, once the unchallenged ruler of New Eden, was no longer a threat. They had been overthrown, not by force, but by a collective decision to take control. In the days that followed, the construction of the microgrid began. The solar panels went up, the energy system was tested, and the community saw firsthand the potential of their new future. The HOA, meanwhile, was scrambling. They couldn't stop the project. They couldn't even slow it down. The residents had made their choice, and the HOA was powerless to undo it. Simmons and the rest of the HOA board attempted to rally their supporters, but it was clear that their influence was slipping away. People were talking about the future, about the possibilities of self-sufficiency and energy independence. The HOA's days were numbered. Alex watched all of this from the sidelines, content in knowing he had started something that would last. The energy in New Eden had shifted, and the people now had the power. They weren't dependent on anyone anymore. Not the HOA. Not the utility companies. They had control of their own future, and that future was brighter than ever. As the sun set over New Eden, Alex leaned back in his chair and smiled. It wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about changing the rules of the game. And in the end, that was worth more than any victory he could have imagined.